Uh, Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the KSM and another certificate course that we've been arranging all throughout the year. To give you all an introduction and to welcome you, I would like to invite Dr. Dushanta Madhikadara, our president this year.
Good morning. I welcome to certificate course organized by the Candy Society of Medicine jointly with Sri Lanka College of Endocrinology today. I think you have witnessed last 1 year. We are conducting series of certificate courses and the workshop on different disciplines, collaborating with the respective specialized colleges and associations to update your knowledge on the particular areas of interest. So today we are having the certificate course on endocrinology, jointly organized by ourselves as well as Sri Lanka College of Endocrinology. First of all, I'd like to thank the President and the Council of Sri Lanka College of Endocrinologists, and particularly the coordinating this whole event, Dr. Charles Anthony Pillay and our senior consultant endocrinologist, National Hospital Kandy, helping me to organize this today's certificate course. And today you will be enlightening on the various areas of interest related to endocrinology. And we had some other programs also last 1 year on different times on some endocrine problems. But today, concentrating mainly on endocrinology problem. And we have several resource persons coming here and working on the other hospital. I think I must thank all of them to helping us to conduct this program. Even with the COVID pandemic, it's not yet up to the pandemic actually, we are not stopping single of our programs. So we are conducting all our routines. And I just want to inform you that we are going to have an annual academic session on 7th, 8th, and 9th of April of this year. And we are calling you abstracts as well as oration on the Candy Society of Medicine oration and the Biblical Memory oration. And you can apply to those orations if you have research. And you can apply for your abstract presentation or oral presentation. So that is the time for you to present some of the research you have already done and to when others to get. And I must thank that today actually our sponsors are about helping us to helping us to conduct this type of program. And we need to have delay. We have to start the programs, and we'll have Sumit start the program. Thank you very much for all of you.
So today's first lecture is on doctors, drugs, and diabetes, drug treatment of type 2 diabetes. It will be delivered by Dr. Nayananda Karunasena, a consultant endocrinologist at the National Hospital Kandy. This please.
Good morning, everybody. So I think I was given the most difficult task to do, talk about all about pharmacological management of type 2 diabetes in half an hour, which is kind of impossible to do. So I'll try to at least do the important things and more practical things when we might use in day-to-day clinical practice. I guess there is a mix of audience here. The registrars and the medical officers are both there, isn't it? Yeah, so it might not be advanced enough for the registrars, but because I tried to a more general thing to suit everyone, right? When it comes to the pharmacological management, we mainly look at the patient's HbA1c. So as I don't have to go through everything about diabetes, so we'll just start with HbA1c. So we give usually a HbA1c ideal target of 7% for all the patients, but this you have to remember that HbA1c target of 7% is not a like a general thing. It has to be individualized based on your patient's factors. So, for example, if it is a young patient who has a more life expectancy and do not have any complications, then you can go for a more stringent target of HbA1c of less than 6.5% even. Even 6 is fine for that sort of a patient. But if it is an elderly patient who has other comorbidities and risk of hypoglycemia is there, then you would probably be happy with the HbA1c target of 8% or less than that. So why I'm talking about this HbA1c is, I think many studies, particularly if you look at this data from the UKPDS, the landmark clinical trial in diabetes and type 2 diabetes patients, it has shown that 1% reduction of HbA1c over 10 years was associated with significant reduction of all any diabetes-related endpoint, including the diabetes-related death, all-cause mortality, myocardial infarction, stroke, and PVD, and microvascular disease, etc. So the most important thing when you are managing your patient is first to determine patient's baseline HbA1c, and then set the target for the individual patient based on the patient factors like age and the comorbidities and hypoglycemic risk, etc. You set the HbA1c target. So, for example, if you get a patient with HbA1c of 10, so what is your target? Are you going to for a 7 or 6.5 or 6, something like that? So, and then you decide how much HbA1 reduction you're aiming at. So, if it is a patient with 10, you probably go for either 3 or 4% reduction of HbA1c based on your patient. To achieve this, we have our non-pharmacological management. I must first say that even the diet and lifestyle management alone can improve the HbA1c by even up to 1.5%. Having keeping that in mind, then we have the pharmacotherapy, which we are aiming at in order to reduce the HbA1c to the desired level. So when it comes to pharmacotherapy, you can divide it into 3 categories: the oral anti-diabetic agents, non-insulin injectables, your GLP-1 receptor agonists, and insulin. I think if you look at over the decades, I think particularly the last 2 decades, there have been a lot of development in management of type 2 diabetes, particularly when it comes to the oral hypoglycemic medications, as well as the insulin and GLP-1 receptor agonists and all that. So I think there is a plethora of medications available in the market at the moment. So this actually can lead to a bit of a dilemma among the doctors, which drug to use in which patient. So you have to be clear about which you can use in which of your patient. And I just wanted to introduce when we say doctors and diabetes. So the therapeutic inertia is another problem. As I said, you need to monitor the patient with HbA1c and make sure that the patient achieves the HbA1c target. So the lack of timely adjustment of the treatment regime when the patient's therapeutic goals are not met is called therapeutic inertia, and most of the time the reason is that doctors might not be aware which drug to use, when to use, and that sort of a thing. So the idea of this lecture is to break this at up to some level. So first we'll talk a bit about the non-insulin anti-diabetic agents. So there are the older medications, the metformins, sulfonylurea, alpha-glucosidase inhibitors, and thiazolidinones, which you know they had been there for quite a long time. And then you have the fairly new classes of medications, the GLP-1 receptor agonist, which is an injectable mostly, and DPP-4 inhibitors, which are together known as the incretins. And then the SGLT2 inhibitors, Nivest, and probably the most popular addition to the diabetic medications. So I will not go through much about the initial ones because I think all of you know about those medications. So out of these, of course, you have your insulin as well. So you have to keep that also in the mind. So out of this medication, which anti-diabetic you are going to use in order to achieve your HbA1c target? So it depends again based on the patient factors. So you have to consider the number of HbA1c or the percentage of HbA1c you have to reduce, and then the individual HbA1c reduction by individual drugs, and then the other comorbidities, presence of cardiovascular disease and particularly renal disease, and then you have to consider the weight of the patient for like that you should always try not to make the patient gain more weight because that will be adversely affect the diabetes control. And then the risk of hypoglycemia should also be considered, and of course the cost is also important when it comes to particularly in countries like ours. So if you look at the HbA1c reduction, so you know the insulin is actually capable. This is actually a crude presentation. This is the graph drawn by me, not by like any article or anything. So it is, the insulin can reduce your HbA1c. I have put at 3.5, but more than that, even from 15 to 7% if necessary. But then all the medications like metformin, sulfonylurea, even 5-glitazone have good HbA1c reduction, which range up to 1.5 to 2%. But if you look at these NIVA medications, you can see that the SGLT2 inhibitors, DPP4 inhibitors, probably the maximum HbA1c reduction is only about 1%, even though they are sort of glamorized medications nowadays. So metformin, I won't go into detail, but it has been there for quite a long time, and we know it's quite a safe drug. And the good things about the metformin is it has low risk of hypoglycemia, and it promotes weight loss and fairly good HbA1c reduction. And this is still considered as the first-line medication in most of the guidelines when it comes to diabetes management. Only problem and the worry is the metformin and the kidney. It can be used as long as the eGFR is more than 30, but when it comes to less than 45, you might have to reduce it to the half of the maximum efficacious dose, that is 1 gram per day, whereas the 2 gram per day is the maximum dose. And then when the eGFR is less than 30, you might need to stop it. You have to stop it. And then metformin has been shown to have some cardiovascular benefit with all the clinical trials like UK-PDS. And the sulfonylureas are your insulin secretogogues, which act by secretion of insulin or stimulation of pancreatic beta cells to secrete more insulin. So this this drug to work, there should be some sort of some beta cell reserve should be there. But the problems are the weight gain and hypoglycemia are the main two problems of this very old and well time-tested medication. There are a lot of sulfonylureas in the market, but I think conventional sulfonylureas like tolbutamide and glibenclamide are kind of out of the practice nowadays. So we most of the time use the modern sulfonylureas. The good thing of modern sulfonylureas are they're associated with less risk of hypoglycemia as compared to the conventional ones. And the main problem with sulfonylurea is the hypoglycemic risk, particularly the long-acting ones like glibenclamide, and sometimes the glimepiride also can cause hypoglycemia. So you have to, and also the glibenclamide is associated with weight gain. So those who have hypoglycemic risk, particularly elderly patients and who have impaired renal function, we have to be cautious when using sulfonylurea, particularly avoid glibenclamide in that sort of patients. And there was some question about the cardiovascular safety in one trial long time ago that was associated with glibenclamide. It was increased cardiovascular risk as compared to the gliclazide and glimepiride. But I think this is not a major thing that you need to worry about because I think most of us don't use glibenclamide anyway. And it's not well-proven cardiovascular risk as well. And then you have your thiazolidinones, which is 5-glitazone, which you use commonly. So these are actually insulin insensitizers. This is actually a very good drug, and it has a very good glycemic potency and reduction of HbA1c. But the problem is because the use of 5-glitazone is kind of limited because of the side effect profile, and it's well known to cause weight gain, probably mainly due to the fluid retention and fat accumulation. And this can be this can in itself lead to worsening of heart failure as well. And if somebody has maculopathy, you should not use it because it can cause macular edema as well. And there is increased fracture risk as well, particularly in elderly. Again, this is a drug you have to choose very cautiously. You might use pioglitazone in young, fit and healthy patients, but when it comes to elderly who have these cardiovascular problems and probably renal disease and all that, you probably should avoid. And those who have a weight problem, those who are already obese and worried about the weight gain, then again avoid this medication. And then you have the alpha glucosidase inhibitor, that is your acarbose, which is mainly acts by inhibiting the carbohydrate absorption from the proximal small intestine. So this is a very good drug when you want to control the postprandial hyperglycemia. If somebody's postprandial blood sugar is persistently high, this can be a very good choice. But again, it is use is limited by the gastrointestinal GI side effects. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the newer medication, that are incretin-based therapy. So what are the incretins? So there are incretins actually in some endogenous substances which are secreted from the gut. So you have the which one is the pointer? Yeah. So you have the incretins are actually endogenous substances. When you take an oral load of glucose, the small intestine brush border produces these two the incretins, the GLP-1 and GIP. So, and this action of these incretins are to act on the pancreas, and they act on the beta cells to increase insulin secretion, thereby increase the glucose uptake by the muscle and fat. And they also act on the alpha cells to reduce the glucagon production, thereby reducing the glucose production by the liver. So this sort of these substances sort of balances the blood sugar level or controls the blood sugar level after a glycemic load in the other naturally occurring incretins. And then there is an enzyme called the DPP4, which rapidly degrade these two incretins, so that the action of this is gone. So what they did was they developed two drugs aiming these incretins, incretins. So this is one drug is the analog to this one. That is a similar one to GLP-1, known as the GLP-1 receptor agonist, and then the inhibitor of this enzyme, the DPP4 inhibitor. So this DPP4 inhibitor, I think, so there are two classes of medications, or the incretins based therapies. That is the GLP-1 receptor agonist and the DPP4 inhibitors. So you all know the DPP4 inhibitors. It is your gliptins, the sitagliptin, vildagliptin, alogliptin, all the gliptins are this DPP4 inhibitor. So these DPP4 inhibitors are a very good class of drug because they don't have a risk of hypoglycemia and no risk of weight gain, but they are not weight losing drugs as well, so they are sort of weight neutral. However, but they need the renal dose adjustment in renal impairment, except for the linagliptin, which can be still used in the full dose in renal impairment. And there is history of or risk of pancreatitis as well. So you have to be cautious and should not be used in patients who have history of pancreatitis in the past. And when it comes to the cardiovascular outcome, the various cardiovascular outcome trials have shown that they are cardiovascular safe. So it doesn't increase the cardiovascular mortality, but there is no additional or increased cardiovascular benefit as well, like some other medications, which I will tell later on. So then comes the GLP-1 receptor agonist. So this is the other incretin based therapy that I showed you, the analog to the GLP-1, which is a naturally occurring incretin. So the GLP-1 receptor agonist, again, good drug because it has a very good HbA1c reduction. And apart from that, it has very good weight reduction effect as well. And it's also at a higher dose. It is sort of approved for the use in obesity, just for the weight reduction. So because of the weight reduction action. And also there have been clinical trials, particularly the leader, I don't have a slide on that, which came up a few years back, that GLP-1 receptor agonist, liraglutide, is increased or associated with improved cardiovascular outcome. That is, there is a cardiovascular benefit in this drug. And but the disadvantage of this drug is this is an injectable. It is the non-insulin injectable, and except for the oral semaglutide, which is of course not available in Sri Lanka, all the other GLP-1 receptor agonists are injectables, and patient has to take either daily or weekly, something like that. And the cost is very high. For example, if you in Sri Lanka, if you try to give it, it can cost even up to 15 to 20,000 per month only for this drug. So most of the patients can't afford because of the cost. Again, these are associated with increased risk of pancreatitis, so should not be used if there is already history of pancreatitis. And then comes the SGLT2 inhibitors. I think this is the latest and the newest class, and probably the most glamorized oral anti-diabetic agents of our time. So the normally you have this SGLT2, that is a sodium glucose co-transporter in the proximal convoluted tubule of the in your nephron. So if you remember your anatomy, in a normal person, about 180 grams of glucose is filtered through these glomerulus in a normal day, and 90% of this is reabsorbed through this transporter, SGLT2 transporter. That is the action of the SGLT2. So what they did was they developed an inhibitor for this transporter. So thereby the glucose reabsorption, the proximally converted tubule is inhibited. So thereby all the blood sugar all the filtered glucose is excreted with the urine through the nephron. So that's how it acts. So the SGLT2 inhibitor is a well talked about drug because apart from the blood sugar reduction, it has other beneficial effects, such as there is not much risk of hypoglycemia, and there is improvement of blood pressure, as well as there is significant weight loss with the use of SGLT2 inhibitors. And good thing, it's a once daily dosing, so it's easy for the patient. And then there are clinical evidence to suggest it has the cardiovascular benefit as well as the renal benefit. So just to highlight, there have been a lot of cardiovascular clinical trials, just to highlight a couple of them. So just the EMPA-REG, this is a trial that they designed to test the cardiovascular safety of the empagliflozin, and this cardiovascular trial showed that the 3-point MACE, that is cardiovascular death, non-fatal MI, and the non-fatal stroke, all the cardiovascular outcomes were low with the empagliflozin, the use of empagliflozin as compared to the placebo. And again, the same thing from the same study, and there was a reduction in hospitalization for heart failure as well. So this came out as a drug which has cardiovascular benefit. And then came the Credence trial about 2 years back. This actually was designed mainly to look at the renal safety of these drugs, because initial drug trials, there was a concern whether that can worsen the renal functions in patients with diabetes. And I won't go through all the details of the trial, but they were mainly looking at the renal safety of the drug. So it was done using the canagliflozin 100 milligram versus the placebo. And just two of the important slides, there was, apart from other benefits, there was reduction in microalbuminuria as compared to the placebo in the patients who were used the canagliflozin. And there was the primary outcome were also reduced, that is the development of end-stage kidney disease, doubling of serum creatinine, renal low, cardiovascular death, all were reduced in the patients who used canagliflozin as compared to the patient that used placebo, and this was a significant reduction. Okay, but you have to, so because of that, I think this has been widely used and particularly become very popular among the cardiologists and the nephrologists as well. So everyone is using, but you have to keep in mind there are side effects which you have to be aware and to avoid, and you have to avoid them. There is increased risk of amputations and fractures with canagliflozin. There is still a black box warning, but the related this Credence trial, they said that there is no increased risk of amputation with canagliflozin, but still the warning is there. And the other main problem is the increased risk of genital infection, including the Fournier's gangrene in men, which can be very deadly and dangerous. So you have to be aware, and if the patient develops the slightest evidence of this recurrent urinary tract infections or genital infection, then you might have to stop this drug. And there is risk of decay, that usually this is a euglycemic ketoacidosis, and then again that you need to keep on mind, and we might have to test promptly for ketone bodies and ketoacidosis. And the advice you have to give is that patient has to take increased volume or the increased fluid in order to prevent those things. So this is basically a summary of what I told, and I don't think I have time to go through all this. So you have to know that individual drug, what are the effect on the cardiovascular disease, what are the effect on the renal functions, and what is the effect on weight, and what is the effect on or the risk of hypoglycemia of these individual drugs. So let's move on to the guidelines quickly, given the time. So this is, as you can see, is from the ADA 2021 guideline, which we usually follow. And you can, as you can see, it's very complicated. And I think they keep on complicating it and making it difficult for you to interpret. So whatever said, so I'll try to simplify it. So what they say is, still metformin is the first line agent in type 2 diabetes management if there are no contraindication. If the patient's renal functions are fine, and if there are no other contraindication, particularly if the patient can tolerate well, you try with the metformin first. So once metformin initiated, you can continue it as long as it is tolerated, and if there is any contraindication, and you can keep on adding other agents on top of metformin. That's what the guidelines say. So as the initial therapy, whatever the HbA1c at the baseline, you're starting with metformin. But there is one exception actually. If the HbA1c is more than 10%, so you need to probably reduce the HbA1c by about 3 or even 4. So sometimes metformin might not be enough alone for a rapid reduction of HbA1c. So in that case, they recommend even using insulin as the first line add-on for the patient, and particularly if there is evidence of ongoing catabolism such as weight loss, and there is evidence of significant hyperglycemia. So, and so what have we? So you can see that this guideline, they have divided into many parts. So there is 1 here, 2, 3, 4 components. So I'll go through them quickly. So from the and here what they have actually mentioned is those who have established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and if there is risk of cardiovascular, if there are evidence of risk factors of ACVD, if there is evidence of kidney disease, or if there is evidence of established heart failure, that is, I think this is still not visible. I have tried to zoom in. So the ejection fraction less than 45%. So in this sort of patients, as I told you in few of the just a couple of trials that I showed, you have to they advise to use a second agent, which is either a SGLT2 inhibitor or a GLP-1 receptor agonist, which has shown to have a cardiovascular renal benefit independent of the baseline HbA1c. That means even if the baseline HbA1c is 8 and you have to reduce only by 1%, and you can, apart from metformin, you can use another either SGLT2 inhibitor or a GLP-1 receptor agonist in this group of patients. That is those who have cardiovascular disease and risk or have risk factors for cardiovascular disease, and those who have renal disease, and also mitral albuminemia should also come there. And that sort of patients, you can use a combination. So the other patients, you can what you can do is you can start with the metformin, and then if you and then monitor your HbA1c every 3 monthly. And then if you think that you are not achieving your HbA1c target after 3 months, then you can go for an add-on drug treatment. So when it comes to the add-on drug treatment, then you have to consider the other patient factors. So if you look at this part of the guideline, so your compelling need is to minimize the hypoglycemia, then you can choose any of the above classes of drugs, that is DPP-4 inhibitor, GLP-1 receptor agonist, SGLT2, or thiazolidinone, that is pioglitazone, except for the sulfonylureas and insulin, which are associated with increased risk of hypoglycemia. And this sort of patient, again, you monitor the HbA1c, and until you achieve the HbA1 target, you go on adding other oral drugs and perhaps insulin and sulfonylurea as the last resort for these patients who have increased risk of hypoglycemia. And those who have risk of like who are obese and in whom you have to stop or prevent further weight gain, what you can do is you can go on initially add the GLP-1 receptor agonist or GLP-2 inhibitor with because they have the weight losing effect as compared to any other medication. And if it is not responding, then you can go for other things like gliptins. And then as the last thing, sulfonylureas, thiazolidinediones, and the insulin, which all can cause weight gain. And if the problem is cost, of course, you don't have much choice. Sulfonylurea and thiazolidinones are the second line agents perhaps, and then probably insulin if you can't achieve the HbA1c target with these drugs. And those who, when it comes to a cost is the problem, probably SGLT2 inhibitors and gliptins are not a good choice, particularly in our hospital setup. Probably this is what we have to do. I mean, because the cost and the availability of the drug in the hospital setting, probably we start with metformin and go on adding the sulfonylurea and thiazolidinol, and then probably insulin to control the HbA1c target. So the next few minutes, I'll sort of quickly touch on the insulin treatment in type 2 diabetes, because I think next lecture probably the insulin will be dealt in more detail because it's type 1 diabetes. So when it so as I said, all these patients, if you are not achieving HbA1c target, you might need insulin at some point. The type 2 diabetes patients, there is a gradual decline in their beta cell reserve, and at some point they might need insulin. So in initiating insulin, I think the most or the best way is to initiate with the basal insulin. So there are so many types of insulin: the ultra short, short acting, intermediate, and long acting insulin. So this just the action of the insulin for various insulin types. There are rapid acting insulin like glycerin, gluclysine, short acting insulin like regular, that is your soluble insulin, which we use in hospital. And then the intermediate action, the non-NPH, which has about action up to perhaps about 18 to 20 hours. And then long-acting insulin like Glargine, Detemir, and of course the Deglutec, the liver drug, which has a longer duration of action. So when you're using insulin in type 2 diabetes, probably you can go for three sort of regimes, basically. The basal insulin along with the oral hypoglycemic, twice daily pre-mixed insulin, or basal bolus regime with the basal plus prandial insulin. So what the guideline says is you can, again, this is from the guideline, as you can see, it's quite complicated. So just to run through it, they suggest when you need an injectable to go for GLP-1 receptor agonist, but I think it's out in our clinical practice. So we go straight to the insulin. So you can start with the basal insulin. When you start a basal insulin, you can start either 10 units per day or 0.1 to 0.2 units per kg per day dose. And then based on the fasting blood sugar level, you adjust your basal insulin or titrate your basal insulin. So these are the types of basal insulins you can use: Glargine, the Detemir, and the NPH, that is your isopen insulin, which is available in hospital. So the main role of the basal insulin is to control the fasting blood sugar. Why we initially worry about the fasting blood sugar? Because it has the major contribution to the HbA1c reduction, whereas the prandial blood sugar or the postprandial blood sugar has a lesser contribution to the HbA1c. So you start with the basal and go on titrating. And if you think that it is not adequate, then you go for adding prandial infusion. But you should avoid over-basalization, that is, giving too much basal insulin. If you have to give a dose more than 0.5 units per kg, or if there is a big difference between the bedtime, morning, or post and preprandial blood sugar levels, then you have to think you are over-basalizing, and that should be corrected. Then you should go for either for a premixed insulin twice a day, or basal plus prandial insulin, or basal plus bolus, that is all three prandial. So as at the beginning, if once you have achieved, if you have not achieved your HbA1c target, and your fasting blood sugar is well controlled, and you are giving more, you have to give more than 0.5 units per kg of basal, then you go on adding the prandial insulin. You can start with the prandial insulin for the either with the largest meal or where the most or the highest postprandial value is there. So you give, you can start with 1 prandial insulin, and then you can up titrate and give up to 3 prandial insulin as shown in this. So you give the basal first, and then if the prandial levels are high, then you add a 1 prandial where the highest, and if it is not enough, you give all 3 prandial insulins. And if you have to go to this level, the other option is to go for the premix insulin twice a day, which is more convenient for the patient sometimes. And there are various different preparations, and I don't have time to go through all those things. So just to summarize, so the approach to choice of anti-diabetic agents in type 2 diabetes is kind of sort of individualized based on the patient factors as well as the HbA1c, and metformin remains the first line of agents, and those who have high risk of established cardiovascular disease, CKD, or heart failure, SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 receptor agonists should be the second line of agent, and others you choose the second agent based on the weight, risk of hypoglycemia, and the cost to the patient. And it's important to start insulin promptly in order to achieve your HbA1c targets. HbA1c targets. Okay, and insulin, you can start as a basal insulin alone with oral hypoglycemic, but you need to titrate and intensify it as necessary, and should keep in mind to avoid over basalization. Thank you very much. Is there time for questions? So I have taken more time, I think. Okay.
There are any questions? We can have about 1 or 2 questions, if any one of you.
Either it was all clear or not, nothing was clear. Okay, in the absence of questions, then we'll.
Thank you, Dr. Karunasena, for that clear and concise account on a very vast subject area. Very well done lecture. And I would like to invite Dr. Charles Anthony Pille, our senior consultant endocrinologist, to hand over the certificate of appreciation. So our next speaker is Dr. Sonali Gunathilaka. She's the consultant endocrinologist at District General Hospital, Nuwara Eliya. She'll be talking to us today on surviving adulthood with type 1 diabetes, management of adult type 1 diabetes.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and given the 30 minutes time limitation, I would like to give the basic concepts of type 1 diabetes. We won't be able to discuss in detail about type 1, its management in detail, or even I would not touch on the detailed aspects of insulin, but I would like you all to take home a key message or key concept in type 1 diabetes. So I hope you all know who are there, and especially Priyanka Chopra And this is not about her, actually. It's about her partner, Nick Jonas. He's a famous singer, and Miss USA in 1999, and many other sportsmen, writers, and uh, lawyers, and the US Supreme Court judges. And obviously, you might know this person, Theresa May, previous Prime Minister in UK. All these people have succeeded their life. They live very nicely, they live very successful lives, but with a challenge. And that is type 1 diabetes has affected all of them. And they have taken the challenge well, and they're living their lives well. And this is how they do, and this is how we try to achieve good control in type 1. And I will take you through these aspects on type 1 through a case history. And this is just to give a glimpse on how should type 1 be managed. Okay, this is Sean, 18-year-old A-level student. Actually, this is a real patient. He's a cyclist. He's one of 3 children in the family, and mother and father were well educated, very good family background. He lived a very active life with his friends, sports, performed well in the school. But suddenly, after a vacation, he presented with significant loss of weight, polyuria and polydipsia for 3 weeks duration. This is all of a sudden. Initially, they didn't take it into account, but symptoms got worsened. And then because of these symptoms, he didn't have any other alarming features. Then he was seen by a nearby doctor, and then HbA1c was found to have been 10.2 with a fasting blood sugar of 340. And the doctor had done very wisely ketone bodies because he's young, and the doctor thought whether is it type 1 or not. And later on, he was further evaluated by a specialist center, and GAD antibodies was positive and was diagnosed as type 1. This, you all know about this, how we diagnose type 1. It's young patients coming with severe symptoms of short duration, and obviously if the antibodies are positive, it is type 1. So what do you mean by type 1? Now imagine you are labeled as type 1. Obviously, as doctors we know, but imagine your son or a neighbor's son or a niece or nephew diagnosed with type 1. It's a big label, it's a big diagnosis. What is it? So if there's a factory which produces keys, and this key is the way to unlock this door so that we can enter the house. So this is the story of glucose control and diabetes. So imagine this factory has a pancreas. Pancreas produces insulin, and they are imagine these keys being insulin. Keys goes to the keyhole and unlocks the door. So the door is open for the glucose to enter. So this is how we regulate our glucose levels in the body. This is how you and I regulate, provided we don't have diabetes. So what is type 1? This factory is defective. It does not produce enough keys. So in that case, if you don't have the key, you can't unlock the door. So the glucose can't enter the house. So this is what happens. So pancreas does not produce enough insulin because this pancreas is defective. In that case, glucose can't enter. So the patient gets hyperglycemia. So if it is the case, what is type 2? What is the difference? So pancreas, the factory is fine and it produces enough insulin, at least at the beginning. So the problem is with the key lock. So key lock is defective. You can't enter the key into the lock because it gets stuck. In that case, you can't open. So the key lock is not sensitive enough for the key. So imagine like this. This is a functional key lock and this is blocked. In that case, again, you can't open the door and the glucose can't enter the house. So this is a problem with the sensitivity type 2 diabetes, but type 1 diabetes is a problem of insulin production. So the person does not have not enough insulin at all at times. So if somebody is not having insulin, obviously the treatment is obvious, it's insulin. So going into the pathology, roughly, this is not in detail. So if this is the Langerhans cells, beta cells are there, and these cells get destroyed gradually. And this is due to various factors, genetic susceptibility, environmental factors, and many other things. So they get destroyed, and the beta cell mass, you can see, it reduces with time. And then this reduction of beta cells is mainly due to an immune process in most of them. So autoantibodies gradually increase with time. And at this point, the patient manifests with diabetes because there's very least amount of beta cells, and the amount of insulin produced by them can't manage the glucose, and the patient presents with sudden onset of all the symptoms of diabetes. So what are the key things in this pathophysiology that we have to know? Autoantibodies, so they are related to this pathogenic process. If we measure, well, we can get an idea whether is it type 1 or type 2. Having said that, not all patients have antibodies, but at the diagnosis, about 80 to 85% of people would have antibodies. And the other thing, beta cells do reduce the number, and insulin production will also get reduced. So if we measure insulin at this diagnosis, yes, it will be very low, and then we can come to a diagnosis. But measuring insulin is very difficult. It's very labile. And then what we do is we measure C-peptide. What is C-peptide? When insulin is produced from the beta cells, another molecule is produced, that is C-peptide. So if there are 10 insulin molecules produced, there will be 10 C-peptides. Only one insulin, only one C-peptide will be produced by the beta cells. In that case, instead of insulin, you can measure C-peptide. But there are caveats in measuring C-peptide as well, because at the beginning, it can be there will be few beta cells left, so you may detect some C-peptides, but as time goes on, there will be absolutely no C-peptides or very less C-peptides. So these two will be important at one point of the course of type 1 diabetes for diagnosis. Okay, so why do we say it is type 1 in Shan? These are the at least clinical discriminative features that we can use to differentiate type 1 and type 2. It's very important when a patient comes to you with diagnosis of diabetes. Anyone can diagnose diabetes. Whether the patient falls into type 2 or type 1 is you should find out, because the management is totally different. And sudden onset of osmotic symptoms like polyuria, polydipsia, weight loss, young onset of diabetes, and no strong family history, and having normal BMI with no features of insulin resistance are key features clinically to suspect type 1. And if you suspect this, you have to treat with insulin, even given the doubt for the patient, and manage these kind of patients in a specialized center. And Shan was positive for GAT, and C-peptide levels we did not do, but if had done, it would have been low. So these are the features that we look for. And so the same thing, it's at our diabetes, the beta cell mass would be very low. And then we tell the patient, okay, you have type 1 diabetes, we label them, and it's a big diagnosis. And we told Shan, okay, you have to be on insulin lifelong. So two things, insulin is alarming for a kid who was running here and there and studying for A-levels. And now we want him to be on insulin from the next day. And lifelong, that's further alarming. And these are things, practical things in patients. We don't take that much into consideration. And then we told, okay, you have to have good control, otherwise you will.
Currently the only person in this conference.
And so that's again, what is this complication? What is the doctor talking about? So all these are challenges to the patient. And as doctors, we should understand the from the point of the patient, what is going on. And imagine it happening to you or your kid or your neighbor or your relative. So we told the insulin is low at the diagnosis and you need to be on insulin. And then Sean was in tears. We told him, okay, look here, if you don't control your diabetes, you will get complications. And you know all the complications related to retinopathy, neuropathy, nephropathy, and macrovascular complications related to heart attacks, and strokes. So why type 1 is different from type 2? I know it's not clear, but if you see this line, the line above, that represents type 1, and the line below shows type 2. Type 1 and type 2. And they are microvascular complications and all the complications. You can appreciate that with time, type 1 patients have more complications than type 2. And this explains the complexity of management as well as inadequate management in type 1 patients. So, Sean was studying for A-levels. So as routine and as in many of the patients in Sri Lanka, type 1 patients, he was started on mixed insulin twice a day. He was happy to be satisfied with 2 injections, and we educated him on insulin dosage and injecting technique and advised to monitor the blood glucose. We strictly advised him to monitor, although he was not very happy. His parents actually managed to get some readings. And okay, these were his readings. I hope you all can see, and it's all over the place. Some days it's good, sometimes it's 200, 300, again going into 80s and 60, again going into hypoglycemia. So he could not predict. He was on mixed insulin, fixed dose, 2010 initially to begin with, and we changed the dose. But he was taking 20 every day in the morning and 10 at night every day, and his sugars were all over the place. He was careful in his diet, but still, this is how it was. And the HbA1c was not that good. And if somebody looks only at a point, fasting blood sugar and PPBS, if it happens to be on this day, it would have given you the ideal control. But if you check the whole profile, this is not a snapshot. If you look at the whole scenario, the sugars were all over the place. So first point is you can't assess a type 1 diabetic patient with fasting and PPBS values. You need to get a proper glucose profile, and this should be done by the patients. And if you can't trust the patients, we always check the glucometer as well. So please, this is what we do, and this 1 point values would not give you an idea. And this is how it looked like. Some values were not there, so there are missing parts. But you see, when we see this, we ask what happened. And then this day, the green line, he had a party previous day. That's why he started up with a very high sugar levels, because his insulin was not enough, apparently. And this ash one, he ate an ice cream. He's an 18-year-old boy. He loves other food that we also like. He, after almost 2 months, he ate an ice cream. Poor kid, he had a high glucose level. And here, he's a cyclist, I told you, and he loves cycling. He went for a cycling session, he cycled after lunch, and he ended up in low sugar levels. Basically, this means that he cannot do what he wants in his life. And he's 18, he has so many years to live. Imagine that happening to you. And that's alarming. His sugars were not satisfactory at all. This is after about 3-4 months, I guess. So Sean is a young boy, and type 1 diabetes occurs in kids as well as young adults. Not to mention that we do get older adults as well, but they have activities of daily living that you and I enjoy. Imagine your last 1 week. Obviously, these weeks we can't, but before the COVID era, imagine your life, imagine your kids' life. It's so energetic, it's full of fun, and they enjoy, right? What if you restrict him? It's very difficult. You might be experiencing it these days. So, restricted life in a teenager or young adult is not good. And it was a challenge for him. And Sean became, like, we noted that he had poor school performance after the diagnosis. He was doing quite well initially. And to go into details, he had a restricted diet. He had limited social activities where he was one of the key figures in the school. He restricted himself and he lacked motivation. He didn't want to do anything because he has this diagnosis. He was depressed, and then diabetes related stress added on. Therefore, this is what he ended up. Then there's a question, are we managing his type 1 correctly? Well, type 1 management is a bundle which involves a lot of key aspects, and including glucose control, daily activities, managing psychological components, support groups, because they need to talk to somebody, and then screen and prevent complications as in type 2, and also prevent complications. They are more, I told you, there are much of fluctuation. They are more prone for high sugar levels as well as very low sugar levels. So it's important to manage holistically, and this takes time and effort. So glycemic control in type 1 is quite different from type 2 because these people do not have insulin. So it's like a teeter-totter, like four-seater teeter-totter. They have to balance it to get a control, to be in control. So what are these key components? Like sugar levels depend on their carbohydrate intake, especially in type 1 more than type 2. And the insulin dose that they inject should match the carbohydrate intake, and physical activities can change their sugar levels as well as metabolic demand of the body, like illness, pregnancy, even menstrual cycles, and many other things. So this is what normal people would have. We take our breakfast, lunch, snack, and a dinner. So the glucose levels fluctuate like this, and the insulin levels do increase according to the sugar levels. So this is what you would be having. And if you miss this breakfast, you will not have this peak of insulin. It will be flat. So okay. Now, what is Sean getting is this, right? It's pre-mix insulin twice a day. What if he, by any chance, misses his morning dose? Well, he would go into hypo if he takes insulin, or if he does not take insulin, hyper because he's taking his lunch. So it's so complicated. And even if he takes 3 meals, you see the peak here. There should be an insulin peak here, but he is not getting that. And there are, like, he should not have this much of insulin here. This is the normal level he should be having, but he is getting. So he would go into hypos here. You can understand what we are doing is not the ideal for type 1s. So what should be the type 1 ideal management? There's a basal level of insulin in any person. So although type 1 patients don't have, we should mimic that. So we should give an insulin to clear that. And then if patient takes breakfast, we should give an insulin to cover that, because our type 1 patient has 0 insulin. And then lunch, we should give an insulin to cover the lunch as well. But you can imagine, you can appreciate the amount of insulin rise for breakfast is more than lunch. So lunch has less amount of insulin rise because his lunch is smaller than the breakfast. So we have to be able to titrate accordingly and give a smaller dose of insulin according to his meal. You can't give 10 TDS of insulin because he's taking small amount of lunch. If he takes a big amount, we should be able to increase. That's how your pancreas thinks. And then to cover the lunch. And this is called, like Nananjali told, this is the basal bolus. This is basal, and these are boluses covering your meals. And this basal bolus, it really mimics your natural physiological insulin secretion. You can see there's hardly any difference. And then you can adjust, like I said, if you take a big meal, you can adjust the insulin. And you can reduce the insulin dose if you are exercising or you are ill or any other changes. So you have more flexibility with your daily life. So this is kind of mimicking what you have now. Okay, so I would not go into detail. Now, Nanjini explained this as well. So there are loads of insulin in the market, and then these are, like you can see, these insulins are quickly acting, and their time in the body is shorter than all these long-acting insulins. So if you can remember the previous picture, we need a long-acting basal insulin. So what are the options? Ideally, in type 1, it should be insulin glargine or insulin degludec, very long-acting. But what we have are the NPH in the hospital system, and also we have Detemir and glargine. So we can use any of these, but the ideal setup, it should be this. This is available in in Sri Lanka. And this is where we should go. Okay, we covered the basal, and where is our prandial, the boluses? They should be short acting because they should only cover the meal. And what we did was we stopped premixed insulin and we started on basal bolus regime. And starting basal bolus regime on type 1 diabetic patients is not enough, right? We should educate the patients to self-manage insulin. So it's different to type 2 diabetes. We ask the patient to manage their insulin. They should be masters in managing their insulin levels, whether to take low levels or high levels. It's them, it's the patient, and it's our responsibility to empower the patient on how to teach how to take it. So he should be able to decide on the insulin dose he should be taking for meals, hyperglycemia, exercise, and illness, and then advise to monitor the blood glucose. And this takes effort. After months and months of reinforcement and teaching, this is what happened. So he injected basal once a day insulin to cover his meals. The basal insulin. And then we taught him to carb count, calculate the amount of carbohydrates in his meal to cover the prandial rise of glucose. So he took a small amount of carbohydrate and he calculates the insulin and injects. He takes a large amount of carbohydrates to lunch and he calculates the insulin and injects. And he corrects the sugar levels because it was higher than the basal. So all these should be taught, and it takes days and days to teach. I'm just touching the concept. And he takes a delayed dinner, and at that time he injects a small amount to cover this. This is all by calculating, and he's happy. So carb counting, just to give you the basics, you can appreciate there are different amounts of rice here. And then when you eat a small amount, your glucose rise is like this. When you eat a large amount, your glucose rise is like this. So there is a method called carb counting, where by different methods, measuring or visual impact like this, you can measure the amount, you can guess it's a guesswork, guess the amount of carbs in the diet. And if you take a banana, this is international figures, not Sri Lankan figures, 17 grams. If you take a naan, it's about 43 grams of carbohydrates, right? And what we ask the patient is to count the carbs in their diet. Imagine this is Shan's breakfast, and you count the carbs. Proteins, you don't have, 0 carbs. And this is 4 grams, 15 grams, 15 grams, and milk 12 grams. So likewise, we add on all the carbs. So it comes to about 50 plus grams of carbs. We have a separate formula for each and every patient for their insulin to carb ratio. So if you take this much of carbs, you have to take this much of insulin. So we educate the patients on that, right? And then they can inject. If the ratio is 1 to 10, So which means that one insulin for 10 grams of carbs, if the patient takes about 60 grams of carbs, he has to take 6 units of insulin. Likewise. Then he was happy, his HbA1c was controlled, and you can appreciate all the values are well within norm. And okay, so we taught Sean carb counting and adjust insulin according to his daily activities and cope up stressors. Sean was happy, he could eat liberally, and he knows what to do and when to do and how to do, right? And he enjoyed life and he has control over his diabetes. Okay. Having said it looks simple, but it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. And what did Sean have? So he had to prick himself like 4 or 6 times, risk of hypos and multiple insulin injections. He had to inject at least 4, and then he need to calculate. He's very lazy about his maths, so he had to calculate the carbs and the insulin. So can Sean test his blood glucose levels without pricking? Can he inject him required insulin levels without always pricking himself with injections? And can he decide the dose of insulin needs to inject without using his brain? Sean does not have these. These are the new things in technology in type 1. So this is called bolus calculator. It includes the current glucose levels and amount of carbs he's taking and level of activity. It's just an app. And then the app decides the insulin he needs to inject. He doesn't have to use the brain. Obviously, needs a little bit of cortex, but he just have to inject. And then these are devices called glucose monitors attached to yourself, and then you just have to flash the device here like this, and then you don't have to prick, and then the value comes. And you can see the arrow, it tells you in the next 1 or 2 hours, your sugar is going up or low or like that. And then you get the profile after 1 week or 1 month, how it changed. And delivery system, he doesn't have to inject himself. There are pumps which runs like for 72 hours. It's just one prick, and then the pump decides, we calculate, we automate, and pump decides what to give and when to give. And then artificial pancreas is coming up. This CGM, the monitor measures the glucose, tells the pump, this is the glucose level, and pump decides what to give. So these are coming up. And so until we get them, still we have to make our patients take control of their type 1 diabetes. And the key way, the take home message is think like a pancreas. In type 1, think like a pancreas and then decide on your insulin. Although it looks simple, patients are calm, there are so many things going on in their head. So be empathetic, and these type 1 patients are not well managed yet in the whole world, as well as in Sri Lanka. We try to improve the type 1 diabetic care. So please do refer to the specialized centers if you suspect type 1 diabetes. Thank you. I would like to take questions, but I think my time is up. Okay. So, yeah, I didn't go into detail about boluses. So giving the bolus insulin in relation to meal is again dependent on your type of insulin. So short-acting insulin, you should be injecting about like 15 minutes prior to the meal. And very rapid-acting ones, the newer insulins, you can inject 5 to 10 minutes before. And there are very new ones like insulin Fiasp and things. They are not yet here, but in abroad it's there. Those kind of very fast-acting insulins can be injected even after meals. So what we have currently, we should be injecting about 15 minutes before. Those concepts are similar to type 2 and type 1. The management concept is the only difference. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gunathilaka, for that excellent presentation. And I would like to call upon Dr. Nananjani Karunasena